March 6, 1944, 4:45 in the morning. The pre-dawn cold cuts through the aluminum skin of the Nissan hut like a knife. Captain James Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group lies in his sleeping bag at Leiston airfield in Suffolk, England, listening to the distant roar of B-17 engines thundering to life across the base. The sound is unmistakable. Not the high whine of fighter engines, but the deep, resonant growl of 4 massive Allison engines working together like a mechanical heartbeat. His eyes snap open. This is different. They've been waiting for this. The pilots of the 357th have been waiting for this moment since they arrived in England 3 weeks ago, green and eager, flying the North American P-51 Mustang, an aircraft still being doubted by many back at headquarters. But Berlin. The target is Berlin. For years, the Germans had laughed. They had scoffed at the idea that American bombers could penetrate to the heart of the Reich without being slaughtered. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. German fighters would shred the flying fortresses before they got close to any target that mattered. That was the assumption. That was the certainty that Berlin rested upon. But on this morning, on March the 6th, 1944, everything was about to change. The sky over Europe in 1943 was German territory. Not diplomatically, not politically, but militarily, it belonged to the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe owned it absolutely. This was not a matter of opinion or propaganda. The Germans had fought the British Royal Air Force to a standstill in the skies, had turned back night bombing with remarkable effectiveness, and had developed a sophisticated system of layered defenses that no one, particularly not the Americans, had successfully penetrated in daylight. When the first American B-17 flying fortresses arrived in England in the spring of 1942, the Germans observed them with clinical interest. A crashed B-17 was recovered in October of 1942, and German military leadership examined it with the thoroughness that German engineers were known for. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal and Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, was remarkably dismissive. He reportedly declared that there was no cause for anxiety about American aircraft, four-engined though they might be. But Erhard Milch, the state secretary for the Luftwaffe, a man with a more realistic assessment of industrial capacity and technical capability, saw the writing on the wall. Standing over the wreckage of that first captured B-17, Milch made an observation that haunted German leadership. "These are worries I just can't get over. We have got to accept that one day the enemy bombers attacking Germany will be flying at altitudes of 28,000 or 30,000 feet. Milch, perhaps more than Göring, understood that Germany would need to develop new tactics and strategies. But for now, in 1942, the Luftwaffe felt supremely confident. The Boeing B-17 had arrived in America's arsenal as a revolutionary concept, a heavy bomber so heavily armed and armored that it could defend itself without fighter escort. The name Flying Fortress was not mere marketing. It reflected genuine capability. By 1944, the definitive B-17G model carried 13. 50 caliber machine guns, nearly 7,500 rounds of ammunition, and an extraordinary ability to absorb devastating damage and still fly. German crews fighting these aircraft week after week would be baffled by bombers that returned to base with engines missing, fuselages riddled with flak, gaping holes where they expected to see structural failure, yet still flying, still holding formation, still getting their bombs on target. But the B-17 had a critical weakness that the Luftwaffe exploited mercilessly. It had no fighter escort over Germany itself. The American strategy, formulated in planning sessions at the highest levels of command, was predicated on daylight precision bombing. At night, the British Royal Air Force flew thousands of sorties, dropping area bombing campaigns against German cities. But the Americans believed precision bombing, striking at the true sources of German military power. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, shipyards would be more efficient, more devastating. The problem was that these targets were well inside German territory, and American fighters in 1942 and 1943 simply did not have the range to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back again. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt could escort bombers, but only to the Rhine. Beyond that, the bombers were on their own, naked and vulnerable, flying through German airspace where the Luftwaffe waited to pounce. The Germans understood the mechanics perfectly. Allow the bombers to penetrate, then attack them when the American fighter escort was forced to turn back. It was a strategy that worked with brutal effectiveness. The period from autumn 1943 to early 1944 became known as Black Week, Black Thursday, and a dozen other designations of horror etched into the memory of American airmen. On September 6, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 338 bombers to Stuttgart. 45 B-17s did not return. Another 10 were written off upon landing. Casualties totaled 600 men, killed, missing, or taken prisoner. The Bosch factory, which was supposed to be destroyed, remained largely intact. But worse was coming. October had begun promisingly enough, with targets in Bremen and other locations yielding apparent successes. But on October 8, 1943, something snapped. The 848th Air Force bombers attacking Bremen encountered German fighters that would not peel away. Standard Luftwaffe tactics involved head-on attacks followed by a breakaway to regain altitude. But this day was different. The German fighters stayed engaged over the target itself, flying through their own anti-aircraft fire to press home their attacks. The 100 the bomb group sent 19 B-17s into combat. 17 did not return. The 305th lost 13 aircraft out of 18 deployed. By mission's end, 30 B-17s were missing, and 300 men were dead or captured. 6 days later came October 14, 1943. The target was Schweinfurt, and the mission entered history as Black Thursday. 291 B-17s took off for Schweinfurt that gray autumn morning. 60 were shot down over Germany. 5 more crashed on approach to Britain. 12 additional aircraft were so severely damaged they were scrapped upon landing. Total American loss: 77 B-17s. Of the 2,900 men in the crews, approximately 650 did not return, though some survived as prisoners of war. Only 33 bombers landed without damage. The German loss was 34 fighters and 16 dead pilots. The mathematics were brutal. The Germans would celebrate. Here was confirmation of what they had always believed. The American daylight bombing campaign was suicidal. Unescorted bombers could not penetrate German airspace and survive. The Luftwaffe could continue defending the Reich indefinitely. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, the famous aviation commander who took over the 8th Air Force in January 1944, understood the political and strategic calculus perfectly. The American people, Congress, the political establishment, they could not sustain the level of attrition the bomber crews were suffering. Something fundamental had to change. The North American P-51 Mustang was born not from American design, but from British need. In 1940, the British Air Ministry needed a fighter that could be produced quickly and in large numbers. Rather than redesigning existing aircraft, they contracted with North American Aviation to build aircraft under license to the current British design. North American, in a moment of characteristic American audacity, said, "No, we'll design something better ourselves." The result was the P-51, initially powered with an Allison engine that made it a competent low-altitude fighter, but nothing revolutionary. The transformation came when a British test pilot, Ronald Harker, suggested installing a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the P-51 airframe. The Merlin was already proving itself in the Supermarine Spitfire, a legendary fighter in its own right. But mated to the P-51's streamlined fuselage and efficient aerodynamics, the combination produced something extraordinary. The American version of the Merlin, called the Packard Veets 1650, delivered tremendous power across a broad altitude range. More critically, it performed exceptionally well at the high altitudes where B-17 bombers operated, above 25,000 feet, where the thinner air and lower temperatures created conditions favoring the Merlin's sophisticated two-stage supercharger. But the Merlin engine alone was not revolutionary. What made the P-51 revolutionary was its aerodynamic efficiency. The aircraft had been designed from the ground up to minimize drag, a laminar flow wing, a smooth fuselage, careful attention to every detail that could reduce wind resistance. This meant that even laden with the auxiliary fuel tanks necessary for extreme range, the P-51 remained maneuverable and fast. A P-51B Mustang could achieve approximately 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude, faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109G at the same altitude by 50 to 60 miles per hour. The German fighter managed 386 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The tactical implication was staggering. American fighters would have speed advantage, altitude advantage, and maneuverability advantage over most German interceptors. And then there was the revolutionary application of auxiliary fuel tanks, not internal tanks, but external drop tanks that could be carried under the wings and jettisoned when empty. With these tanks, a P-51B Mustang could fly from southern England to Berlin and back, with fuel to spare. Without any tanks, the journey was impossible. With the tanks, it was merely difficult. The first P-51s began arriving in England in the autumn of 1943. The 357th Fighter Group, the first pure Mustang-equipped fighter group in the 8th Air Force, began combat operations in February 1944 during a period called Big Week, a concentrated bombing campaign against German aircraft production facilities. The group's experience was meager, their pilots green, their tactics still being refined. By the standards of the experienced European air war, the 357th was amateur hour. But that would change very soon. March 4th, 1944. Briefing began in the pre-dawn darkness. The maps were laid out. The red tape extended from Leiston across the North Sea, across Holland and Belgium, deep into Germany, pointing with geometric precision to Berlin itself. The briefing room erupted in a mixture of excitement and nervous tension. The capital of the Reich, the heart of German power, the city that the Luftwaffe was absolutely supposed to protect. Captain Bud Anderson, recently promoted and now flying his plane in a leadership capacity, listened as the briefing officers explained the plan. P-47s would escort the bombers to the Rhine, where their fuel reserves would force them to turn back. A gap would then open where bombers would be unescorted. But then, and here the plan took on historic significance, Mustangs of the 357th would join the formation over Berlin itself, provide target area support, and then return the bombers safely home. The problem was that the 357th had only been in combat for 3 weeks. Their group commander, Colonel Russ Spicer, was relatively inexperienced himself. Anderson's own combat leadership experience was limited. They would be flying against the most experienced fighter pilots in Europe, over the most heavily defended city in Germany, flying aircraft they had only recently mastered. If the plan failed, if the Mustangs failed to reach Berlin, or failed to arrive on time, the consequences would be another massacre of B-17s and crews. The mission launched on March 6, 1944, in the cold pre-dawn darkness. 48 P-51s of the 357th Fighter Group, the entire combat strength of the unit, took off from Leiston. Anderson was flying in Captain Cia the Bud. Anderson's flight? Wait, he was Cia Bud Anderson, leading the flight, navigating by radio and instinct and hope toward a rendezvous with history. The German Luftwaffe was waiting, as always. German radar had picked up the bomber stream. German fighter groups were scrambled. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf 190s launched from bases across northern Germany, their pilots certain that they would engage another group of unescorted bombers. The pattern was established. The choreography was known. German fighters would attack, bombers would fall, American crews would die, and the sky would remain German. Except this time, as the German pilots formed up and turned toward the bomber stream, something appeared in the sky that they had been told was impossible. American fighters, over Berlin. The German pilots saw them first on their radar scopes, but radar was often unreliable, often showed ghosts, sometimes was misinterpreted. Then they saw them visually. Sleek, silver fighters with an unfamiliar silhouette. Not the chunky P-47s they knew, with their distinctive elliptical wings and heavy fuselage. Not the P-38s, with their distinctive twin booms. These were different. These were Mustangs, and they appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944, like a revelation of strategic truth. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots had been told repeatedly that they were defending an impregnable fortress. that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Americans could produce, that the capital of the Reich was safe from single-engine American fighters, that the sky over Berlin belonged to the Luftwaffe. Now German pilots looked at their fuel gauges, looked at the Mustangs, and experienced something they had never quite felt before: doubt. One Luftwaffe pilot, Hartmann Heinz Knoke, commanding a squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7th, "Yesterday changed everything. We had always known where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological dimension was crucial. German fighter pilots, even the experienced ones, had built their worldview and their tactics on the assumption of sanctuary in German airspace. Training schools had been located in central Germany because they were supposed to be beyond fighter range. Assembly areas, weapons factories, aircraft production facilities, all had been placed where they were supposed to be safe. Now, in a single morning, the entire strategic geography of the war had shifted. There was no safe place. German airspace, German territory itself, had become a battleground for fighters. But beyond psychology was the cold mathematics of aircraft performance. A P-51B Mustang equipped with a Packard Merlin V1650 engine and carrying drop tanks could reach approximately 3,000 kilometers, roughly 1,900 miles. From Leiston airfield in Suffolk to Berlin and back was well within this range. More than that, the aircraft could fight effectively at the altitudes where B-17s operated. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, which equipped many Luftwaffe fighter units by early 1944, had critical altitude limitations. Equipped with a single-stage supercharger, the German fighter began losing power significantly above 18,000 feet. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where B-17s typically operated, the Bf-109 was gasping for power, its engine struggling in the thin atmosphere. The Mustang's two-stage Merlin engine, by contrast, continued delivering robust power at those same altitudes. A P-51B could maintain approximately 390 miles per hour at 28,000 feet, demonstrably faster than the Bf-109G at the same altitude. Combined with superior maneuverability, better visibility for the pilot, thanks to the new bubble-top canopy that had recently been introduced, and exceptional range, the P-51 represented a fundamental shift in fighter capability. German pilots, particularly experienced ones who understood the implications of what they were seeing, grasped the strategic catastrophe almost immediately. Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, was one of the most highly decorated and experienced fighter pilots in the world. 104 confirmed victories, a tactical genius, a man who had fought in Spain, fought in France, fought for 4 years over Europe. In spring 1944, Galland encountered a formation of B-17s, escorted by P-51s over a German target. The engagement that followed was not a tactical problem to be solved. It was a harbinger of the future. German pilots who flew captured Mustangs confirmed what their instruments and performance data indicated. The aircraft was superior in many respects to the best German fighters. German engineers and pilots ran comparative tests. The results were shocking. The P-51 could turn inside a Bf-109. The P-51 could outrun a Bf-109 at altitude. The P-51 could dive more effectively. In almost every critical measure, the Mustang demonstrated superiority. The revelation was so significant that the German High Command initially refused to believe reports from frontline pilots. Hermann Göring had to be shown gun camera footage from German fighters clearly depicting P-51s over Berlin before he accepted the reality. His reaction, reported various ways but consistent in meaning, amounted to an admission that the war was lost. The exact quote often attributed to him, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," may or may not be historically verified, but it captures the emotional and strategic truth of the moment. What was certain was that the Luftwaffe High Command understood with devastating clarity what the P-51's appearance over Berlin meant. It meant that every assumption about defending the Reich, every calculation about air superiority, every piece of strategic planning was now obsolete. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin in March 1944 set off a chain reaction in German military planning and resource allocation that would ultimately contribute significantly to the Nazi defeat. The immediate consequence was that the Luftwaffe was forced to commit additional fighters to the defense of German airspace. Fighters that might have been deployed to the Eastern Front, where the Soviet advance was accelerating, were instead locked into a defensive role over Germany. Consider the mathematics of this diversion. In 1944, German fighter production actually increased compared to 1943. German factories, despite the bombing campaign, were producing more fighters than ever. Yet these additional aircraft were not available for offensive operations or for defending eastern territories. They were needed to defend German cities, German factories, German airspace against the relentless American bombing campaign that now had fighter escort all the way to the deepest targets. The second consequence was the accelerated depletion of experienced German fighter pilots. The Luftwaffe had long operated on a policy that was fundamentally different from the Americans and British. Once a pilot reached a certain number of victories, or once he was deemed a valuable training asset, he could be rotated back to training duties. This meant that experienced pilots passed along their knowledge to new generations. The system worked well when Germany was winning, when combat was sporadic, when the pilot pool was large. But by 1943 and 1944, the system was breaking down catastrophically. In the first 6 months of 1943 alone, Germany lost 1,100 fighter pilots, 60% of those on strength at the beginning of the year. The losses were not evenly distributed. The experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced, and the replacement pilots were, by necessity, inadequately trained. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter pilot training program had been gutted. Flying schools that had once conducted methodical, thorough training now served as expedited pipelines to the front line. A pilot who might once have received 225 hours of training now received 160 hours. By spring 1944, pilots were sent to combat units with as few as 112 hours of training total. Compare this to the American training program, which still provided 225 to 300 hours of training before a pilot saw combat. The statistical outcome was inevitable. New German pilots, flying aircraft that were increasingly difficult to maintain due to production disruptions and material shortages, encountered American pilots who had both superior aircraft and vastly superior training and experience. 50% of American fighter pilot losses occurred in their first 10 missions. A German replacement pilot flying a Bf-109 or Fu-190 against a veteran P-51 pilot flying his 50th mission was essentially a man sent to his death. German leadership understood this perfectly. They watched as their own Air Force slowly bled away, replaced by inadequately trained pilots flying increasingly inferior aircraft, facing American pilots who got better with every mission. While fighters battled in the sky, another campaign was unfolding at altitude that would prove equally decisive. Beginning in May 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces initiated a sustained bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel plants. These plants were not merely important to the German war effort, they were essential. Germany had virtually no natural petroleum reserves. The entire nation depended on synthetic fuel production from brown coal, and this production was concentrated in a small number of massive, complex facilities like Luna, Paulitz, and others. The bombing campaign against these plants was devastating. But the campaign could only succeed because American bombers now had fighter escort all the way to these distant targets. Without the P-51 Mustang, without the technical ability to provide fighter protection over deep German territory, these bombing raids could not have been sustained. The consequences were catastrophic for Germany. By autumn 1944, German fuel production had been reduced to a fraction of peacetime levels. Tank formations began running short on fuel. The Luftwaffe, which was desperately trying to maintain fighter strength, found itself unable to fly training missions because fuel was too precious to use for anything but combat operations. The aviation fuel crisis became a strangling constraint on German ability to wage war. For American fighter pilots, the arrival of the P-51 and the shift in tactics initiated by General Doolittle in January 1944 represented a fundamental change in mission and psychology. Early in the war, Fighter pilots had been constrained by orders: stay with the bombers, protect the bombers, keep the bombers safe. The fighter pilot role was defensive, constrained, reactive. But Doolittle changed the culture overnight. He found a sign in a fighter group commander's office that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." He ordered it removed. From that day forward, the sign read, "The first duty of our fighters is to destroy German fighters." This was not merely a change of tactics. It was a change of philosophy, of mission, of psychological orientation. American fighter pilots equipped with superior aircraft that could now operate over all of Germany, and given permission to hunt enemy fighters, transformed from protectors into predators. Bud Anderson, the same pilot who flew that historic March 6th mission over Berlin, would go on to become one of the most decorated American fighter pilots of the war. But in that first mission over Berlin in the P-51, what mattered most was that he and his fellow pilots from the 357th Fighter Group demonstrated that American fighters could not only reach Germany, but could fight and win over German territory. The psychological shock to the Luftwaffe was matched by the psychological transformation in the American pilot corps. American pilots who had once been constrained by defensive orders now found themselves hunting the Luftwaffe over its own territory. The advantage was overwhelming. German pilots, facing pressure on multiple fronts, flying limited hours due to fuel constraints, encountering American veterans in superior aircraft, began experiencing losses at an unsustainable rate. By summer 1944, the implications of the P-51's introduction had become statistically undeniable. German fighter production, despite reaching record levels in September 1944, with 3,300 aircraft manufactured that month, could not keep pace with losses. September 1944 saw German fighter losses of 3,217 aircraft. The nation was destroying its own air force faster than the most efficient industrial economy on Earth could build replacements. But the losses were not merely in aircraft, they were in pilots. Each lost pilot represented not just a warrior, but training, investment, irreplaceable experience. A Luftwaffe pilot lost in September 1944 was replaced, if at all, by a replacement pilot with a fraction of the training. The quality cascade accelerated the downward spiral. German designer Kurt Tank, the legendary engineer who had designed the Focke-Wulf 190, visited frontline units in December 1944, expecting to see the product of his engineering genius in combat. Instead, he found something that horrified him. Aircraft were being delivered to combat units with critical defects. Engines that should run for 100 hours were failing after 10. Control surfaces were jamming. Gun systems were misaligned. The dispersed production system, the emergency measures, the all-out efforts to replace losses, all of it was resulting in aircraft that were fundamentally unreliable. Tank's assessment was blunt. We had gone from producing the world's finest fighters to pushing out flying death traps. The workers were exhausted, the materials were substandard, and the testing was non-existent. We were sabotaging ourselves. By D-Day in June 1944, less than 4 months after the P-51s first appeared over Berlin, the Luftwaffe was already a fundamentally diminished force. German fighters were available in numbers, but they were flown by pilots with inadequate training, maintaining aircraft with growing technical defects, facing overwhelming opposition in terms of both quantity and quality. The German Air Force, which had been able to contest air superiority over Germany itself just months earlier, had been reduced to a force struggling to merely survive. The vast majority of German pilots who flew in combat in 1944 and 1945 were statistically not going to survive the war. German pilot casualty rates reached levels that make contemporary observers shudder. By late 1944, a German pilot entering combat could expect to survive perhaps 10 to 20 combat missions before being killed, wounded, captured, or suffering mechanical failure. These were not odds that humans could sustain psychologically. The complete turnover of the German pilot corps occurred between early and summer 1944. Almost the entire experienced cadre of German pilots was either dead, wounded, captured, or retreated to training duties. They were replaced by men who had trained for half the hours that American pilots received, who flew aircraft that were increasingly unreliable, who faced opposition that was numerically superior and technically superior. What historians often treat as a tactical development, the introduction of the P-51 Mustang and its use as a long-range fighter escort, was actually a strategic revolution. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin forced a fundamental reassessment of German defensive strategy. Everything the German High Command had planned, every assumption upon which German strategy rested, was suddenly obsolete. The most immediate consequence was the diversion of scarce German resources to air defense. Fighters, flak batteries, radar equipment, all were concentrated in a defensive strategy that ultimately failed. These resources were not available for the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were steadily advancing. They were not available for the defense against invasion preparations for what would become D-Day. They were locked into a defensive posture against an opponent that had achieved something the German leadership had believed impossible, penetrating German airspace with fighters. The second consequence was the acceleration of German industrial collapse. The synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, aircraft production facilities, these were now all vulnerable to sustained daylight attack by bombers with fighter escort. The bombing campaigns that followed the introduction of the P-51 Mustang were extraordinarily destructive. The German war economy, already under strain from years of conflict, began collapsing under the weight of systematic, sustained bombing with fighter protection. The third consequence, often overlooked by historians focused on equipment and strategy, was the psychological and human cost of the air war. German pilots, like pilots everywhere, were human beings capable of experiencing fear, shock, and despair. The appearance of superior American aircraft, the realization that the sky they had once controlled was now contested and then lost, the steady attrition of friends and comrades, these took a psychological toll that manifested in reduced morale, sometimes in reduced effectiveness, occasionally in refusal to continue combat operations. By the end of 1944 and into early 1945, air superiority over Germany was absolute and uncontested. American fighters could operate anywhere, anytime against opposition that was numerically large but tactically ineffective. A P-51 pilot in his 50th mission, flying a machine he had mastered, facing a replacement Luftwaffe pilot in his second mission, flying an aircraft with manufacturing defects, was essentially engaging in predatory aviation. The statistics reflected this. By the end of the war, P-51 Mustang pilots had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other American fighter type in Europe. The vast majority of these kills came after March 1944, after the Mustang had appeared over Berlin and the Luftwaffe had begun its final decline. The North American P-51 Mustang destroyed the Luftwaffe, not because it was merely a superior aircraft, though it was, but because it changed the rules of engagement in a way that German strategy could not accommodate. It made the sky over Germany penetrable. It made every target vulnerable. It forced the Luftwaffe into a position of perpetual disadvantage, and it allowed American bombers previously forced to choose between defensive formation flying and random attrition to complete their missions and return to base with increasing consistency. For the Germans, the period from Black Thursday in October 1943 through the introduction of the P-51 in March 1944 marked a transition from confidence to crisis to collapse. In the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe had genuinely believed it could defeat the American daylight bombing campaign through attrition. The losses were terrible for the Americans, yes, but they would eventually force the Americans to change their strategy or abandon daylight bombing altogether. This was not fantasy. It was based on months of empirical evidence showing American bombers being slaughtered in unescorted formations. The Americans, facing those catastrophic losses, could have abandoned daylight bombing. Politically and militarily, it would have been defensible. sustaining 600-man losses in a single day, losing 77 aircraft in a single mission, watching crews achieve percentages of casualties that military planners considered unacceptable. This was a situation that could have been reversed. But the Americans persisted. They waited for the technical solution they knew was coming. They endured the losses. And when the P-51 arrived in numbers, equipped with drop tanks, flown by increasingly experienced pilots, they changed tactics and unleashed a campaign that Germany could not defend against. The total cost of the American strategic bombing campaign over Germany is measurable in aircraft lost, in aircrew deaths, in wounded, in captured. American bomber and fighter losses over Europe totaled approximately 10,500 aircraft by war's end. American Air Force losses in the European theater totaled roughly 27,700 personnel killed or missing in action. German losses in the air war were even more staggering. German fighter losses by late 1944 and 1945 were so severe that the Luftwaffe began attempting desperate measures. Operation Bodenplatte in January 1945 was a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields intended to knock out American and British fighters. The operation failed catastrophically, with the Luftwaffe losing 644 fighters in 8 days of operations, with 644 pilots killed or captured. In exchange, the Luftwaffe destroyed approximately 150 Allied aircraft. The mathematics were final. The Luftwaffe was destroying itself, trying to defend against an opponent it could no longer defeat or even contest on equal terms. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. German pilots, who had once been among the finest in the world, had been replaced by desperate men flying unreliable machines against opponents who were numerically superior and technically superior. German airfields were captured or destroyed. German aircraft production, despite heroic efforts at dispersal and emergency measures, had collapsed under the sustained bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe, which had claimed dominion over European skies in 1941 and 1942, which had resisted British air power to something approaching stalemate in 1943, was completely defeated by 1945. This defeat was not inevitable. It came about through a combination of factors: American strategic determination to continue daylight bombing despite terrible losses, American technical achievement in producing a fighter that could escort bombers over the entire German territory, American tactical flexibility under commanders like Doolittle, American pilot training that produced experienced, confident pilots who could employ superior aircraft effectively, and German strategic rigidity, German technical conservatism, and German inability to adapt to a changed situation. Most critically for understanding history, the defeat of the Luftwaffe and the domination of the skies by American fighters was not primarily the result of differences in courage or national character. German fighter pilots were as brave as American pilots. German engineers were as skilled as American engineers. German aircraft, individually evaluated, were often competitive with American aircraft. The difference was in systems, in scale, in industrial capacity, in willingness to sustain losses for a strategic objective. The Americans could afford to lose bombers and crews in the pursuit of strategic bombing. The Americans could afford to keep bomber crews flying despite terrible attrition. The Americans could afford to absorb the losses from a battle of attrition and keep fighting. Germany could not. When the P-51 appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944, piloted by men like Bud Anderson and his fellow pilots of the 357 Fighter Group, it was not merely an appearance of a new aircraft. It was the appearance of American industrial capacity, American strategic will, American technical achievement, and American ability to transform hope into reality in the face of an enemy that had seemed invincible. For the Germans, standing in that moment over Berlin in the spring of 1944, looking at American fighters that should have been impossible, there was the knowledge that the sky, which they had owned so completely, had been lost, and with it had been lost the war itself. The path to German defeat in 1945 ran through the skies over Germany in 1944, and it was patrolled by men flying P-51 Mustangs. The Germans had laughed at the Americans. But when they saw this in the sky, when they saw that American science and will and industrial capacity could produce an aircraft that could outfight German fighters over German territory, the laughter died, replaced by the understanding that they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted,